There was a time after his first season in the NFL, so going into his second year, where the cost for Kyle Pitts was like the 20th pick in the draft. He might not even be a top 20 drafted tight end this year.
Fantasy football draft season is here, and I'm actually really excited to talk with you because I don't like to beat around the bush. I'm not the best at fantasy football, and I need you to give me the exact lineup. I need the exact lineup, man. What's going to win me all my fantasy leagues this year? Because I'm tired of losing.
Okay, so, I think that one of the things that people probably overlook is they think that what they can do in the first round of their fantasy league is win their league, when the more likelihood or the higher likelihood is that you can lose your league in the first round by doing something unorthodox. You got to stick to sort of the conventional wisdom in the first round. So here's what we're doing. We're drafting a lot of running backs this year. Need those running backs. They're hard to find. So if you're on the board, there's a decent one available, you got to take a running back. There is more depth at wide receiver, and there's really good depth at quarterback this year. So if you're going to draft a quarterback, what you need to do is focus on 5 players early. If you're not going to draft a quarterback early, you don't worry about anybody named Jaden Daniels, Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, Jalen Hurts, and Joe Burrow, because they're all going to be long gone by the time that you're worrying about a quarterback. So speaking generally, good depth at quarterback, but there is that elite tier that if you want to spend big, you can. And then I always think that some of the small mistakes set people back. It's the taking a kicker way too early, taking a defense way too early. And I've played in leagues with cousins, friends, my wife, and sometimes the criteria that they use to select the players is not the strongest. Players that play with cool mascots, players from a particular city. Try to focus on the football side of it, and your team is going to be very successful this season.
I'm glad you kind of jumped ahead too with the follow-up that I was going to ask you was kind of the theme to this year's draft and how you should approach it. And it sounds like running backs early is what you said. There's a lot of running backs.
Running backs early is definitely one of the themes this year. Okay. Some of the names at the very top: Bijan Robinson from the Atlanta Falcons. He amongst the best players in all of fantasy football. Saquon Barkley from the Eagles, who is kind of the king of the NFL at this moment, reigning Super Bowl champion, cover athlete for Madden, 99 rating on Madden, highest paid running back ever. Life is good for Saquon. Jahmyr Gibbs from the Detroit Lions, also a very, very highly touted running back. And then we're looking for some fresh blood this year, which is Ashton Jeanty, who was the 6th overall pick in the NFL draft for the Las Vegas Raiders. So those 3 plus Ashton Jeanty, plus, of course, Christian McCaffrey, who will forever have a place in fantasy football lore because he's been the king of fantasy football on multiple seasons. This past year, he was devastated by injury, but by all accounts, he is healthy right now going into the season. At his apex, is still one of the best players in the entire league.
I'm glad you mentioned Bjon Robinson. It seems like the consensus #1 running back in this year's draft, and he had a monster year his sophomore campaign. Just under 1,500 rushing yards, 14 touchdowns, and then you throw in the 61 receptions. He had almost 500 yards. Beast. Do you believe that he can top those numbers? And if so, what do you feel like his ceiling is if he has one?
I think he can top those yards and those numbers. But the good news is that even if he just comes within like 90% of that production from last year, he'll still pay off that value. When you're trying to build the sort of perfect franchise running back for fantasy football purposes, and I suppose real life purposes, you're looking for a guy who's got a really good shot to be top 5 in rushing attempts, rushing touchdowns, targets, and receiving yards. I left out rushing yards, and I also left out receiving touchdowns. They're hard to come by. Receiving touchdowns are for running backs. And I think if you get a ton of volume on the ground, it usually means you're rushing for a decent amount of yardage per carry. So the yards will follow as well. On top of all of those things that Bijan brings to the table, he's young too. It's his 3rd season in the NFL, not nearly as much tread on the tires as guys like Christian McCaffrey, and to a degree, Saquon Barkley, Derrick Henry, other veteran players who are incredible, to be clear, but have a little more risk just based off of their age. History has told us in the NFL that a lot of running backs by the age of 27 or 28 are no longer anywhere near the caliber of player that they were when they're 22, 23, 24.
Yeah. Sticking with the Falcons, Kyle Pitts, I see the memes every year, and of course everybody jokes about how they're going to draft him regardless, or convinced that every year is his year. And I know he comes up short. Is this finally the year that we see something massive out of the tight end?
What's the old expression? Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. What would the version of fool me three times? I don't know what we say after that. Fool me three times and you just wasted a fantasy football pick. Um, here's the good news for Kyle Pitts. There was a time after his first season in the NFL, so going into his second year, where the cost for Kyle Pitts was like the 20th pick in the draft. He might not even be a top 20 drafted tight end this year. So for fantasy football purposes, you're kind of getting him for free. I would say that I am more comfortable with many, many other options, and I'll just let someone else take Kyle Pitts. I think I remind people often there's this emotional part of fantasy football. It's like, no matter how many numbers your players put up, if you win, you think that it's, like this crafty management and you deserve all the praise. And when you lose, you think, how stupid can I be? I should have never done those things. And if you've already had Kyle Pitts in your roster, it's largely been underwhelming. You don't want to go back down that road once again.
Speaking of some of the guys falling in the rankings, I was looking at some names, and there are a few things that stood out to me as far as guys who've taken a big step backwards in the rankings. And I want to give you three guys, and I want you to tell me which one surprises you the most. So Tyreek Hill at 26 overall, Travis Kelce at 83 overall, or CJ Stroud at 143 overall.
Yeah, the most surprising one to me is CJ Stroud, not because I disagree with where he's going, but because going into last year, so August of 2024, we're thinking to ourselves, he could be a top 5 or 7 quarterback. Usually in the NFL, we see guys make a huge leap from year 1 to year 2. I joke that rookies spend the first month of their NFL career just figuring out what everybody's name is in the building and where to find the cafeteria, right? Year 2, you're humming, you're full speed, you're locked in. CJ Stroud was amazing coming out of the gates as a rookie in the NFL back in 2023. 2024, when you'd think he'd be way better, things were not that. He took a major step back for fantasy football purposes. He had one game all season with just 20 or more fantasy points. Almost unfathomable. He had this great receiver core on paper coming into this season. No doubt that injuries played a part in CJ Stroud's performance last season. But the biggest cheat code or superpower for a quarterback in fantasy football is the ability to run. And CJ Stroud is a good athlete who the Texans limit his rushing opportunities because he's their most important player on the roster. So Stroud is deserving in terms of where he is being ranked right now, but I didn't imagine that based off of how I thought things were trending at this time last year.
Yeah. Every year, there's someone in the drafts who's brand new to fantasy football who messes up their drafts. That has been me before. For anyone scrambling right after, I know I need to speak more highly of myself, but it's just when it comes to fantasy football, it's like, oh my God, I get too into it. But for those of us who have scrambled after the draft to fix things, what would you say or who would you say are some of the guys that might make it to the waiver wire that are worth consideration due to their upside?
I'll give you a couple of names here. They're running backs, especially, that are running as the second back in their backfield, but they don't look like starters, and they might not be starters unless there's an injury. Kyle Monungai from the Chicago Bears, who sounds like he's the backup to DeAndre Swift. Swift, I have optimism around, but Swift is one of those players that sometimes has looked better on paper than he has in practice. There's a good example of one. The Chargers drafted a player named Keandre Lambert-Smith. He's a wide receiver out of Auburn via Penn State, who I think has a chance to be a useful player, even though they now have Ladd McConkey and Keenan Allen, who's back on the roster. I always find myself leaning towards rookies. One more is Brenton Strange, who's a Jacksonville Jaguars tight end, now going into year 3. The team has had some nice words about what Strange can become. He was a second-round pick just a few years ago, wouldn't surprise me if he establishes himself as a Trevor Lawrence comfort blanket.